right. Welcome everybody to Magic Giveth.
I'm not, but I am coffee.
And Magic Taketh away.
I think everyone just heard that.
Dactyl? Do you have the book?
These are 6 incredibly talented fantasy authors, and we're all very lucky to have them, so let's give them a hand. I'm going to start by making some introductions. To my left is Stephanie Garber. Stephanie Garber is the #1 New York Times best-selling and internationally best-selling author of Caraval and Legendary. Caraval has been translated into over 30 languages, and its film rights have been optioned by 20th Century Fox. When she's not writing, Stephanie teaches creative writing in Northern California. Welcome, Stephanie. Yeah. Next we have Tomi Adeyemi. Do you guys know who she is or no? Tomi is the #1 New York Times bestselling Nigerian-American author of Children of Blood and Bone. After graduating Harvard University with an honors degree in English literature, she received a fellowship to study West African mythology, religion, and culture in Salvador, Brazil. When she's not working on her novels or watching BTS music videos, she can be found blogging and teaching creative writing on her website, tomiadeyemi.com, and she lives in San Diego, California. Welcome, Tomi. Next we have Sara Hanover. Sara lives with a hoard of books, rather like a dragon, and works on improving her imagination daily. She loves plot twists and cats, family and crispy autumn leaves, traveling and good food. Her novel, The Late Great Wizard, the first in the Wayward Mages Portal Fantasy series, will be available from DAW Books in September. Welcome, Sara. Next we have Daniel José Older. Daniel is the New York Times bestselling author of the young adult series The Shadow Shaper Cipher, the Bone Street Roomba Urban Fantasy series, and most recently Star Wars / Shot in the middle grade historical fantasy Dactyl Hill Squad. Welcome, Daniel. Yay! Sabaa Tahir. Woo! Another #1 New York Times bestselling author, this time of An Ember of the Ashes and its sequel, A Torch Against the Night. She grew up in California's Mojave Desert at her family's 18-year motel. There she spent her time devouring fantasy novels, raiding her brother's comic book stash, and playing guitar badly. That's not my good. She began writing An Ember in the Ashes while working nights as a newspaper editor. She likes Thunder's indie rock, Air Socks, and all things nerd. She currently lives in the San Francisco Bay Area with her family. Welcome, Sabaa.
Hey.
And last but not least, we have Sam Sykes. Woo! Sam is the author of the Bring Down Heaven trilogy, The Affinity for Steel Omnibus, Brave Chef Brianna, and 7 Blades in Black. He can lift a tire over his head, but only when no one's looking. Again, not my judgment. He lives in Arizona. Welcome, Sam.
Hey.
All right, so our format will be pretty simple. I'm just going to ask a few questions to each of these authors, and then we're going to open it up for audience questions, which you can see at the mic right there. Okay, all of you, let's start with the way that you draw your heroes. I think that for each of you, they're relatable, they're empowered, and obviously when dealing with magic, there's a lot of responsibility that goes into that. So for each of you, and we can start from my left, what for you is the balance that you have to strike between giving them these powers and keeping them relatable for the reader?
I think, so my main protagonists, Scarlett and Tella in Caraval and Legendary, they're sisters, and they don't have magic in the first 2 books, at least. And so, for Scarlett, I kind of saw, her superpower as the way she loves her sister. I wanted to write a female character that it was okay, what is something, for me, it's I was literally the kid who was picked last in school. I was not intentionally picked for a team until, I think it was late junior high, all growing up. I was just really awkward, not strong, very weak, uncoordinated, all that stuff. And so I wanted, a character who's had like interior power that was like, okay, very achievable. So that's for her. And then I think like her younger sister, Donatella, also doesn't have magic powers, but she was kind of the girl. I wanted to give her just a lot of like, I'm trying to think of the word in terms of, because I think like you give your powers, whether they have like actual magic powers or not, like everyone has to have something special if you're making them your main character. And so Donatella was kind of the girl I always wanted to be. I gave her like all this bravery that I didn't have, and just like the type of girl who just didn't feel shame in a way that I think I felt, and that a lot of, I imagine, females feel, and just empowerment to go after things even if she's making mistakes, even if she messes up. So I kind of gave them like very human qualities, but in a superhuman way, or at least for me, it's like these are things that I don't have to that extreme, that I wish I was this brave, and I wish I was this loving, and I wish that when I messed up, I didn't just quit or want to give up.
Yeah, I feel like I wasn't that creative, because I say like if I'm the level 5 version of me, then my main character, Zaylee, is like the level 50 version. So I think we have the same impulses, and we have the same emotional reactions, and I gave her a lot of my like emotional pain, but also a lot of my like, oh, here's what I wish I would do. Like someone does something annoying and I want to hit them, but that's illegal, so I don't. But in the book, Zaylee will take out her staff and actually hit them. So it feels like I just got to write a me without appropriate impulses or inhibitions, I guess. She has appropriate impulses, no inhibitions, and that's what I really like about her. So, but I think because I was taking from a human, that's what kept it human, if that makes sense.
My main character doesn't believe in magic, but magic believes in her, which causes a lot of problems. She finds that she doesn't have magic powers, but she's able to use magically imbued items, which she finds out very slowly throughout the book as each little thing happens, what is happening to her. But she's a striker on a field hockey team. She's used to team players, but she's also used to a little bit of roller derby action. So she's kind of a powerful girl on her own. And she threw her father out of the house because his gambling addiction cost her college, the family home, her mother's reputation, and they're building the pieces after. So most of the book is building a new life and then finding out that magic exists, and boy, is that even more trouble than she ever thought she was in.
Okay, so you know when like you're a kid and you really love animals and you think that if you stare at an animal hard enough and think something and then like maybe it'll do it? Like if you like blink and then the dog is like, you're like, oh my God, it's like, and then one day your parents take you to a llama farm and this is relatable, right? And then you're like staring at the llamas because you've never seen anything like that in your life. It's so weird and cool, and they carry packs, you know, in the mountains, and you're like, holy crap. And then you're like staring at them, and then you're just staring at them for so long, you like lean your head down on the fence, and then suddenly it's like, bzz, and then you fly across the, you guys know what I'm talking about, right? Like that's happened to all of us, right? Me neither. But anyway, for those weird people who are like that, which is not me, obviously, writing the other is important. This book is for y'all. No, Magdalise Roca is the main character in Dactyl Hill Squad, and it's like that, but with dinosaurs, which is kind of like my whole aesthetic. It's like this, but with dinosaurs, right? So she, in the very beginning of the book, the wagon from the Colored Orphans Asylum, which is where she lives, it's 1863, Brooklyn, and there's a Triceratops wagon leaving for the field trip, and she wasn't really sure she wanted to go, but it's leaving without her, and finally she does want to go because there's a Shakespeare play going on, and she loves Shakespeare. So she's running after it, but it's leaving without her, and she's like, Varney, no! Varney's the Triceratops, obviously. And Varney stops, even though she didn't yell it, she just thought it. And in that moment, she's like, holy shoot skis. It's middle grade, so anyway. She's like, oh my God, I think I have magical powers. So to answer your question, it's that we meet Magdalise in the moment when she's really just discovering the fact that she has this connection to dinosaurs, especially one's named Varney, that she can actually speak to them through her mind.
Cool.
I need this book. So the characters in Ember don't really start off with magic. They just start off with a lot of pain. And as the series goes on, magic is something that comes to a few of them, and it only brings trouble. And the goal there was sort of to show that even when you think that this stuff is going to solve your problems, it's not going to. You still have to solve them yourself. And so as the series goes on, we have more characters sort of encountering this magic, because in the series, magic is being woken up as the books go on. So in the fourth book, it's sort of, I think, all going to come to a head, but I don't want to spoil, so I'll stop talking now.
I typically don't try to balance anything because that seems like work. And I'm a big believer in escalating rather than balancing things. So in terms of magic, my personal rule for writing anything magical is that for every problem it solves, it has to create one more problem. In the Bring Down Heaven trilogy, there's only one character that can use magic, and he's it's a secondary world fantasy, so Reddit doesn't exist. But if it did, he would use it. And he has all this incredible power, but he's very young, and he can't figure out why burning things and making things explode with his mind does not instantly get him respect, because he's weird and unpleasant. And so I like to, the further I go into that series, it's completed now, so I don't care about spoiling anything, the more problems he gets. And if the problem can't come from something that he can solve with magic, it has to come from a problem that is made by his magic. So the more magic he uses, the less human he becomes. And that doesn't exactly make him relatable, outside of the fact that I think everyone has had a situation where they have all the tools to make something right and somehow keep making it worse.
Good answer. And I think that the idea of escalation gets at something that I've been thinking about. Tomi, particularly, you had talked about how in the lead up to your first book, you sort of realized that book 1 is almost starting at book 7 now. And this idea of fantasy has changed so dramatically in the past few years in terms of how fast it moves and how intense it is and how each book builds on the last. So I'm wondering for each of you whether you've been writing in this space for several years or whether you have your first book, how you have found the current climate of fantasy and starting a new series, and if you have been writing it for some time, how you have seen the genre evolve.
I mean, there's brown people in it now. That's nice.
Yeah!
That's the main evolution that I care about.
Next question. That's a word. That's true.
Anybody else?
Well, she said it.
I mean, I'll build on that a little. I mean, it's pretty friggin' awesome right now in that no one really has a massive, set in stone expectation of what fantasy has to be. If anything, people want a lot of different fantasy right now. And I think that's amazing because, I started publishing 10 years ago maybe. And back then, it was basically Tolkien, Game of Thrones was big back then. So you either had to copy Game of Thrones or copy Tolkien. And so there was only so many instances of not Europe people could do. But now, there's just so many wild settings inspired by so many backgrounds and so much myth that I think we have sort of hit this point where we're going to start seeing all of those new things start influencing even more new things. So I think this is extremely exciting, especially for anyone who wants to write now that had an idea that couldn't be published 10 years ago. This is fertile ground.
Also building off that, it's very real, the better the the better the material is, the more you inspire. Like, it's like literally Shadow Shaper and An Ember in the Ashes is what led to Children of Blood and Bone, and not having those books beforehand, the stories I could write just didn't have the imagination, and they just weren't right, because I was like, when you read something great, you can then be like, oh, now I can do this. It just keeps getting better and better and better. So I feel like we're gonna keep seeing not only diverse and epic stories, but just like I just got excited for all the future stories we'll get to read, so.
Me and Daniel will take full credit for her.
Yes, do it.
Absolutely.
I'm going to take a minute to rock the silver, because I've been writing and publishing since the late 70s, before most of you guys were born. And although there's been a lot of white men fantasy out there, there were a lot of great women writing fantasy with people of all color when I started. In fact, my mother was a librarian and an educator, and she came in with a bunch of books one day and slapped them down in front of me when I was first writing. And she said, "This is Andre Norton. She's a woman. This is a pen name. If she can write and get published, you can too." And this is back when women didn't write science fiction. And my first year in SIFWA, I was told I couldn't go in and go to the SIFWA meeting because I looked about 10 years younger at the time than I was, and they didn't believe I had my pro card. And it was really interesting to see people evolve. And yes, I read Tolkien eventually. The first time I read it, I was bored silly. So I read a lot of Heinlein and Ursula Le Guin and other great writers at the time. And I met a lot of people that I was too shy to attach myself to, because I'm an introvert, believe it or not. But we read people like, for instance, Tad Williams, who influenced Game of Thrones, if anybody's familiar with Tad's great books. And I was just really excited to see women writers get into the field, and then eventually women of color. And it's like, we can go anywhere now, and it's great to see. And I will say that my first book that really rocked me was a book called Red Moon, Black Mountain by Joy Chant, who was an English writer, and her hero dies. And you know all through the book he's going to die, he's going to be a human sacrifice. We didn't kill anybody back then. She must have influenced George terribly.
I think what's cool, building off what people have been saying, it's exciting, it's really exciting that we're in a moment where there's new faces and faces that folks haven't seen before, as has been said, both writing the books and finally on the covers of books. Because even back when we were writing, we'd write a book about a character of color and there would magically be a teacup on the cover or some shit that had nothing to do with the book.
Yeah,
or like a dragon silhouetted just in case it had a race that wasn't white, whatever. So that's exciting, but it's also I think now we get to go deeper than that, and it's really cool that there are deeper and different, there's a diversity of narrative philosophies and styles and rhythms and themes that are happening. So it's not just we're taking the same old one dude to rule them all story and just painting a black or brown face on it. Children of Blood and Bone is a book about community. You know what I mean? We didn't get books about community when it was all white folks writing fantasy, because there was such an obsession with oneness and individuality. And it's very cool that now there are so many different styles of storytelling and understandings of timing and rhythm and narrative structure coming out. That's why we're in the golden age of fantasy, for so many other reasons. And it's because writers, mostly women of color writers, fought for this moment to happen and put their careers on the line and continued to fight to hold that line, that we could be here today.
Sabaa, I'm curious about you specifically, because you're drawing on these vast Muslim mythologies which previously in publishing just hadn't been explored. So I'm wondering about your journey to getting that published and to, as Daniel said, fighting to have those stories told.
So I was influenced by my mother, who used to try to scare the bejesus out of me as a little kid with stories about jinn. So I think she didn't want me to wander off. And so she would tell me that jinn lived in trees, and that if you disturbed a tree at night, a jinn would come knocking on your door and possess you. These were scary, not appropriate for a 6-year-old child stories.
That's awesome.
By the way, I've tried to share this mythology with my children. She's like, "Don't scare them." but it was, when I started writing Ember, it took me 6 years to write the first book and to sort of build the world. And it was just really important to me that be represented. I didn't know how to tell a fantasy story without my own mythology in it. Everything else bored me. And so I wanted to tell something that I found really interesting and fascinating, and something that I knew that other kids who look like me, which is a vast swath of like the Earth's population, would connect to. I wanted them to hear and feel seen with these stories. So that was just something that was always a big part of the book. The Jinn character was actually the very first character who came to me. And so it was really just about weaving that in so deeply that the story wouldn't work without it. And then once it got picked up, I've never had an issue. No one has ever said, less Jinn, more like, I don't know, non-Jinn, no more elves. Like, no, like they want more, they want the Jinn, and they want the efforts and that mythology. They want that world because people want to see it.
Yeah. And more broadly, I think all art is political, and of course fantasy especially I think is very political. But particularly in this era, we see a lot of people throwing it more explicitly into their work. And I know, Tomi, you've spoken about creating a Black Lives Matter inspired fantasy, and I'm wondering for each of you, because magic represents power in a lot of ways, how you have specifically gone about drawing up your fantasy worlds, and whether and to what degree and in what way specifically you wanted to be political and what issues you wanted to bring across. We'll start on this.
I think, when I first wrote Caraval, it was like, the whole climate of everything was really different. It was like, I think it was like 2014 when I wrote it. And I think what influenced me, I wasn't thinking politically, but I was thinking about like religion and faith a lot. Like I grew up with like a faith background. And so like when I formed the magic world in it, I was kind of thinking like, okay, a lot of the fantasy I read, it's like either magic exists or it doesn't exist. And if magic exists, most people believe the same way about it. But like, I was kind of thinking like, what if it exists more like faith in the world, and how people think, can see the same things, and some people will be like, oh, this is God, oh no, that's just a coincidence, or that's magic, or people see things different ways based on like how they're raised and the lens they view the world, and just the idea of also like being raised to believe certain things. Like, when you're kids, it's like, hey, you can, what your parents tell you or what your religion indoctrinates you to or anything like that. Like you grow up and then, questioning those beliefs and how those things change, and just like the idea of these characters who, Scarlett and Tella have a very abusive father who's kind of taught them like as females, they're kind of worthless. They need a man to take care of them. Basically, they've been brainwashed to believe, or Scarlett has been brainwashed to believe a lot of things about her that's not true. And so I just kind of like put the idea of like magic and like using that to be like, that was her hope. And then growing up and how our ideas about that shifted, which, so I think my ideas were kind of shifted for religion, and just the idea of like, what if I switch it with magic and realize like we see things differently, and what we believe to be true at one point changes. And so like for me, that's what influenced it. And but yeah, I was thinking more like that, which does play a role in a lot of politics in the world. So
yeah, when I started, I didn't know Children of Blood and Bone would be so much about the Black Lives Matter movement. I knew I was going to write a story about that, but I thought that was going to be a separate story. So I knew I wanted to write this West African fantasy, and I knew I wanted to write this book about Black Lives Matter, but I thought that would be a contemporary, since that's what we were seeing. But just even taking steps away from that, as I guess my journey to publication has all these different layers, so sometimes it's difficult to talk about. But one thing I noticed was that as I was reading a lot of these fantasies to kind of figure out what fantasy was today, I noticed that, like almost every fantasy story and every sci-fi story is in some way a story of oppression. Which makes it even crazier that there's never black people in them, because it was always like, I sort of realized that people were treating these real life problems that people are going through every day, like, oh, what if there was dragons? and racism, but I was like, but you're not. So I saw all these things that I was like, wait, I'm actually dealing with this, and it'd be nice to. Okay, so that was sort of my lens on it, is realizing like, oh, that's actually really messed up for reasons beyond the lack of representation, because I think something that people talk about a lot with Children of Blood and Bone is that they really feel it, and it's like, I think you can really feel it because it's coming from a real place. So maybe they're in a giant ship battle, maybe it's this big sort of confrontation, but like every time I had to write something bad, I was looking at a real video. So even within the first chapter, where Zaylee has a confrontation with a guard, I was looking at a video of this 17-year-old girl in Florida at a pool party, and the police come and they just swarm in. It's a bunch of black kids, and this policeman grabs her and throws her to the ground. And so there was no way for it. Like, I was using real things, and I did that because I knew I was going to tell this big story, but at the end, I didn't want people to be like, aren't you glad it's not like that anymore, and be like, oh, okay, well, actually. So that's really, for me, why I couldn't just do the work behind or in the book. I had to write an author's note at the end, because I knew it would go over a lot of people's heads, and a lot of people tell me, they're like, I'm so happy that you did that, because I would have completely missed it. I would have just been like, this is a great story. And I wanted to write a great story, but for it to do what I want it to do, people had to know that it's real, so that everything they felt for the characters, they need to be feeling for the people all around them. And yeah.
I'm a little bit at a loss in this company because I had just finished a real heavy epic fantasy series, and I wanted to write something fun. So I wrote an urban fantasy with a snarky heroine, and I had an absolute blast writing it. But in the middle of it crept in family and how important it really is, and friendship and ties. And I introduced characters of fantasy origin who are outcast in our world for various reasons. And I had a lot of fun with them. But in book 2, The New Improved Sorceress, it's getting dark, and in book 3 it'll be even darker. But it is intended to be a fun series. I kind of had it after the current election and said, I need escapism, sorry. And so, I had an absolute blast writing this book, The Late Great Wizard. I have two souls in one body who fight with each other. One's a Greek god, and the other's a crusty old professor who's been through X number of lives and wants another one. And of course Tessa, who doesn't believe in magic, and a bunch of other people. And they're in Virginia. So we have a certain amount of heritage and culture and racism that are all there. And but it's not the center of the book at this point in time, but it will be later. So I bow to everybody who has it in their current book, because it really needs to be dealt with.
I think it's so interesting to hear different writers talk strategy, right? There's sort of a thing out there that's like, oh, as soon as you write anything that's remotely political, you're didactic and you're preaching. I think what really it is if you don't pay attention to the politics of your book, it's very easy to fall into didacticism and preaching, especially towing whatever the party line is. And the party line for so long has been white supremacy and patriarchy. So it's very dangerous to just kind of be like, whatever, So I love that people are like, just engaging with it so deeply. For me, a lot of the politics, by which I mean the truth of the world that I see, is in world building. I think of world building as kind of like harmony, as opposed to story, which is like melody, right? The story is kind of a line from A to B, even if there's lots of different chronological jumps in there. It's just generally kind of a straight line. Or a wavy line, but world building is like you have so much room to play. They're like stacked notes, they're like chords, and they move throughout the piece, but there's a lot of different opportunity to kind of get in different forms of storytelling. So what stories do the streets tell, whether they be the streets of Brooklyn now, or the streets of Brooklyn in 1863, or the streets of Havana? The street is always talking to us, it's always whispering, sometimes singing, sometimes yelling. And often that story is a tragedy. It's about gentrification. It's about seeing two different kinds of stores next to each other that give a whole history of the neighborhood without a single character saying a single line of dialogue, And I think that's beautiful. That's so powerful. So I try to tap into that with my work in terms of world building. Obviously, in 1863, politics are right there. But I also try to think about the politics we don't talk enough about, which in this case is really about dealing with northern racism too, and how messed up a lot of stuff that was happening in the North was that doesn't make it to the history books because we have a very simplified sort of dichotomy about good guys and bad guys, and what does that mean? But there was a whole other story, many stories going on during the Civil War, which was people of color, you know, being protagonists and surviving and fighting for freedom in different ways that we never get to talk about. So a lot of Dactyl Hill is about recuperating those stories and finding them and then having them riding on dinosaurs.
Sort of building off what you said, Daniel, a friend of mine always says that you can't have effective world building without good descriptions of food, which I agree with because I like to eat while I read. So like if you have really good descriptions of food, then I can read, which is pretty much my favorite thing to do. I digress. I think you can't really have good world building without politics.
Right.
I don't feel like I know how to write a book that is not at least somewhat socially aware.
Right.
I began to write Ember when I was working at the Washington Post as an editor. I was working the night desk. I don't know if it was because nighttime sort of messes with people's heads or what, but I was reading all these really dark stories about war and death and oppression, and they all made their way into the book, and it still stuns me to meet people who are like, oh, you know, having child soldiers in your book isn't exactly realistic, and then having to tell them that there are child soldiers right now in the Democratic Republic of Congo. There were child soldiers during the Liberian Civil War. Having people talk about, you know, how genocide isn't really something we should really, you know, that we necessarily need to be thinking about, but there was a genocide in Sudan just a few years ago. These are all things that I feel like I have to put them in my books because I want to tell an honest story about my people, and what is happening to them. There's a line in my last book that came directly from my life, which was a character saying, "Why is it always us? Why does this always happen to us?" And that came from watching what was happening to immigrants in this country and the Muslim ban, watching Muslims the world over either kill each other or get killed or get drone striked or whatever the case may be, and having no outlet for that other than the books. So I don't really know how to not incorporate that. I feel like it's like a weird form of therapy.
Yeah, magic is power, and, you know, I think it's perhaps more present than ever that the first thing with people with power do is tend to decide who is human and who isn't, and whose problems rank highest on the hierarchy of issues and so forth. With magic, that's basically impossible to avoid, because if you have the power to fly or to shoot fire or to turn someone into a spider, then you have a completely different way of looking at things. And, you know, in my books, wizards are this sort of, they reserve themselves, they pull out of world politics, which in itself is like a tremendously privileged position to be able to say, like, you know, your problems don't concern me anymore. And so a lot of their issues end up being, you know, pulling out wound up being a huge issue for them. And I think Sabaa has touched on something extremely important here. If you're not looking at that, at least acknowledging it, or at least being aware of it, you're not being honest. And if you're not being honest, then you're like you said, your book lacks a certain realness, because there's a blind spot that your book is pointedly not looking at, and readers can tell. They might not always bring it up, but they know when you're pointedly not looking at it. And like in Lord of the Rings, when people talk about, oh yeah, all orcs are evil, and you know the first thing you do is like, all orcs? every
All
orc is
orcs
evil?
matter.
But if you don't, like, I feel like if you're not at least aware of it, you don't necessarily have to have an answer, but if you don't at least, like, look at that blind spot, then your reader certainly will.
That's a great note to end this portion on. If anybody has questions, there's a microphone over there if you guys want to start lining up. And I'll get up at once. We have more, if not.
Hello. Hi, Daniel.
Hey, how's it going?
Great. How are you?
Good.
Having a good time. Sorry, he was on my podcast, and he's great. And we want Tomi on our podcast, too. Witherton about Harry Potter. Anyway, this question is for Tomi. I was just thinking, I was wondering, so in the, I don't know how to ask this without spoilers. So you write Children of Blood and Bone with the system of magic, and then the system of magic or the rules are changing. When you were coming up with your system of magic, did you have to think about what the rules were and then how they're going to change? Or did you just let that kind of like go with the story? Like, do you know what the next book?
Yeah, that's a really funny question. I like the way you did it though, because I was like, is she gonna spoil?
I'm so bad at spoilers too, so I did it, guys. Yeah.
The way I write is like I start with imagination, and in this case, it was seeing the Orisha, and I was like, oh, okay, I know where this is going, and I know how this magic is gonna work. So I just go with imagination. And then it becomes something that has to be real, and that's something that has to work, and something that has to align with one world. So I wouldn't say even starting Children of Bone towards the end. It was like getting something and then making everything fit together. And sometimes that's just around the magic, but a lot of times that involves plot, that involves character arcs, that involves the social commentary I was trying to make, that involves real world accuracy and trying to make sure that when you're using something inspired by a real world thing, it's not always going to mash up perfectly, but everything needs to make sense. You can't just change something because you're like, well, I like it more. So all of this is to say it was a hamster wheel. So it's like I had my hamster, just think of that like chubby little hamster. And that was my first draft. And then it started running. And then the wheel started spinning faster. So its body was just plastered and it was just going again and again and again. And I basically did that until like the third week of December when I had to turn it in or it wouldn't be on shelves. So that's I guess the short way of saying, or I guess the long way of saying, it changed a lot. And going into book 2, I didn't have time to think about it before I started it, so no, I didn't know what was gonna happen. Now I know what I'm doing, and I know I just have to get through it and then still revise again to make sure it all works. So yeah, people are like, what happens? I was like, we'll find out together.
Yes.
But thank you.
This is geared towards Sabaa or Tomi. I'm a writer myself, however, my cohort, in dealing with cultural mythology and utilizing being myself biracial as well as gay, I was told that I should make my title character more or less friendly with his secondary, as friends rather. How do you go about just pushing through your idea and hoping the readers will appreciate someone who is of color as well as a different sexual preference?
I think you have to believe in your story. Your story, like we need your story. We don't have enough stories like yours out there. I mean, not even close. So I would say that one, believe the story that you have in your heart, that you want to tell. Believe in it enough to stick to what you think should be told. If there is a romance there between two friends, then that is what you are writing, and you go for it. Go full into it. Don't do any half measures. Don't go halfway. Go all the way. Right. Believe in that story that you're telling.
And people, like a good story, it doesn't matter, especially in this day and age. There used to be, there used to be buttholes who would take a good story and say, oh, actually it's not gonna work because, people don't wanna see that, or people don't wanna see that. And it's like a good story is all people root for, and that's all people really want, and readers will connect with that because at the end of the day, it's human. And so good stories are very human, which is why everyone can relate to that. Like I have, a lot of times I'll get emails from elderly white women, and they'll always start it out with, I'm just an old white lady, but I love this. And it always starts out in parentheses. It was like a pattern. And they were like, I know this, but it's like, no, good stories are for everyone. And so that's really all you need to focus on. Make it honest, make it human, make it good, and people will connect.
Yeah,
May I add something to that?
Yeah.
At the soul of every good story is a relationship. And I think we tend to overvalue romantic relationships a lot in media. But the truth is, like, two people connecting in any way is something that people want to see more of. You know, this is why there are people sending death threats to each other over shipping, because that is hard. You know, don't do that. But by all means, absolutely lean into this and trust that they will want to see this, because the more you believe it, as Sara said, the more they will.
Yeah, you have to write that story. I'm working on a short story now called The Soul of Lost Books. And it's all the stories that got lost because the writer didn't have the courage to bring it forth and make it stand. And The Soul of Lost Books is a terrible, dreary, oppressed place trying to spring free. And you've got to tell your story. You've got to have your characters, and you've got to let the love go, because that's love and hope. There's one point in my book, second book, where one of the main characters comes to Tessa and says, "You want magic or you want hope?" And she says, "Hope. Any day, I want hope."
I feel like a Gryffindor, like my Slytherin one was like, magic.
I've been sorted.
Hello. So my question is, not counting your own novels, or particularly the magic systems in your own novels, which magic system in another novel would you say is your favorite? And I don't want you to just say Harry Potter in case that was your first option.
Does it have to be a novel? Because it's always going to be Avatar, Last Airbender.
Yeah, I was going to say Last Airbender.
That was a good answer, yeah. True.
If you want.
Like,
I mean, yeah.
There's like no. I don't think I've ever seen anything that beats what Avatar: Last Airbender does, in that the magic is everything. It's cultural, right. It's philosophy, it's politics, it's everything, and they tie it in so great, and it explains everything. Every character relates to it a different way. Aside from that, I don't know, like, you can't ask for me to have read actual books.
Also, shout out to Azula and my Entirely over there, because that is amazing group cosplay.
Yes.
I'm just gonna say that the Lumitere Chronicles, because I think they're totally underread and they're my favorite books, and I think anyone should read them anytime. And the magic system, I don't even know if you know what the whole system is, but a lot of times it comes from people doing horrible, evil, awful, wicked things. And these big curses will happen where a whole kingdom, every woman becomes barren and they have no children at all because of the horrible, awful things that have happened. And so it's just those books, and they're really, really relevant today, and they're genius, and everyone should read them.
As a Star Wars fan, I would, and there are Star Wars books, I happen to know. But like the Force is actually really cool, and not just because you can like throw dudes around the room and like float and shit. Also because like it's dealt with in a very complicated way. I think in terms of like, you know, the Jedi are actually trash. But there's some cool ones, you know, and like it's a very complicated world there. You know what I mean? Like we simplify it a little bit, or I think it gets simplified in the kind of common cultural understanding of it. But when you get deeper in, and you know, Clone Wars and everything, you just see how it all fell apart, right? Like there's so much complexity there, and I think like especially with Last Jedi, we see them really struggling with that in a really complicated way that we hadn't seen before. You know, just Luke trying to figure out what that means, and like what is balance if you're trying to wipe out all the bad guys? You don't have balance anymore, right? There's so many questions that get asked. And I just think it's a really, actually well-developed magic system that doesn't get enough credit. Because who's ever heard of Star Wars? It's very unknown. Yeah.
I love the magic system in Pelennor. It's a series by Alison Croghan because the entire thing is based off of music. And like every bit of magic is related to music. And this isn't like somebody who has like a sort of, you know, top level understanding of music. You can tell she really, really goes into how this entire world is built around a song. And I still to this day have never read anything like that before. It's a very poetic book. I highly recommend it.
I'm going to say, I've read so many books, the magic systems are really mixed up. because I read voraciously. All I can say is my magic system. Magic is not easy. It's not elegant. It's brutal and it's terribly clumsy. And it takes every single magic class that I have demands a heavy price of its user. If you're a mage, it's your life. If you're a sorceress, it's your memory. If you're a shifter, it's blood. If you're an alchemist, it's losing friends and isolating yourself. So that's, everybody has a different magic system, and the important thing is to know what it is and what the price is, what you gain from it, and are you willing to do what it takes to have that kind of magic.
Hi. My 2 takeaways from San Diego Comic-Con are Jedi are trash and demons are rubbish. It's great. So I had a quick question. So I just finished my first book and I sent it out to some readers, and one of them said, I don't understand how this magic works. And I went, schnozberries, I never created my magic system. So my question is, in your writings, how much of the story is shaped by the magic system and how much of the magic system is shaped by the story?
Good question.
For me, it goes back and forth. It's like I start with, here's what I want to happen, and I just get that out on paper, and then it's like this crazy Jenga puzzle of like, okay, but here's how politics work, so let's weave that in, and now I have to alter this, and okay, actually, this doesn't give this character a chance to sign, and what if there was blood magic? That happened like 2 months before I was supposed to be done, so it really, really just keeps going, and you just kind of, for me, my friend, I don't know if she's here, her name is Shay, but she said like editing a book is like taking the chainmail that the old knights would used to wear and taking it apart just to add one new chain and putting it back together. And she's a cosplayer, which is why she would know exactly how that is. But that's kind of what it's like. So at least for me, it just goes back and forth until I'm not allowed to touch it anymore.
I think it's a conversation between world building and character for me. So, if I'm creating a world where dinosaurs are part of the landscape of the universe and they're beasts of burden and they're just a part of daily life, what character is most interesting in that world? And it turns out, for me, it's the one that can reach them and communicate with them, and has a special connection with them, right? With Shadow Shaper, it's a world where murals can come to life and protect people. So what's a character, how can a character most deeply and intimately relate to that? It would be a muralist, a teenage muralist, who then learns to have that power to bring murals to life. And I think that it's exactly that. It's an interplay, right? So you do a little world building, you do some magic, and then you fit characters in and see where they fit in, and then you keep developing forward.
Yeah, and just as someone who, A, took 6 years to write a book, as I said, and B, didn't figure out the magic system until like 6 months before I ended up selling it. Iteration is a beautiful thing. So you can edit that stuff in and make it work. I like Daniel, prefer character sort of as above all else, and then plot, and then magic and world building are kind of things that I add in as I go.
I feel like it almost behooves you to leave some significant wiggle room with your magic system, because you'll notice a common thread throughout this discussion is a lot of it is just straight up whatever you think is cool.
Improvisation.
And you don't want to if you lay down a super rigid magic system, and you suddenly have, I don't know, like someone who makes squirrels explode and uses that in war. You don't want to hit a point where you're like, oh no, because of the pact of non-squirrel explosion, I can't use that.
Stealing that too.
Yeah. And just now we've
done that. Yes, we
story
wrote a
here.
book. Saber-tooth squirrels.
There we go. Well done.
If it's urban fantasy, it would be were squirrels.
Right.
And they would be in love.
And also, you can afford to trust your reader to get it. And in fact, even if they don't get what you explicitly set down, that's not necessarily a bad thing, because it means they put a lot of themselves in that book and how it works for them.
And the most important thing is that magic can't solve your problems. It has to create them. If your characters come to a chasm and they can't say, oh, I've got the magic jumping spell, and they're over. It just can't work like that. Magic just is not simple. It's not easy. It's not without terrible concentration and price, and most magic doesn't work. Your wizard will try something 4 or 5 times before he finds something that works, and then he forgets the spell, so you're really in trouble.
Well, for me, I started out with Caraval. I wanted it to be really simple. I was like, I want to write a book that anyone who's not even a big fantasy lover can get into. So my world building with the magic was very simple, and also kind of like very loose in the way I did it, because it's like, is it magic at first? It's like, is this real? Is it magic? Do people, is everyone just lying? Like, how we see it, is it magic or not? But then, like, right now I'm working on the 3rd book, and so, like, my characters and the plot really drove that story a lot more. And now the 3rd book, you learn a lot more about the magic system, because I learned a lot more about it, and specifically the cost to the characters, and this one thing has kind of driven everything. So I kind of just see it always as a seed, and it's like you build from one seed, and everything grows from that. And so I think, it's like, what is your one seed? And everything should grow from your one seed. And if you have multiple seeds, you might want to simplify, or just make sure that they all come back to this one point where it all revolves around, and then it can get bigger as your stories get bigger.
Okay, this has been a great conversation, but unfortunately we are out of time. Thank you all so much for your questions, and thank you to these amazing authors.